Good evening, everyone. Good afternoon. Good morning. I'm Avi Grossman. This is Parsha Talk, and with us tonight is Dr. Baruch Sterman, who is apparently, at least I've been to where he produces the Tekhelet. He is, I just lost it. Hold on. Dr. Sterman, I'm so sorry that I can't tell everybody who you are because my notes just fell off the screen. Here. Oh, yeah. He's the CEO and co-founder of Psil Tekhelet and author of The Rarest Blue, the remarkable story of an ancient color lost to history and rediscovered, and also the winner of the Jewish Journal Book Prize. So that's quite a resume. Or in layman's terms, Dr. Sterman has been very helpful. He's been almost essential for all of us Yidden who have sought to perform the commandment of Tzitzit, putting the fringes on the four corners of our garments in the fullest capacity. Most of us are familiar from childhood with tzitzit, the white strings made of wool that hang on our garments and on our talit katan, talit gadol. And the Torah says that you're also supposed to put a little bit of tekhelet, a psil tekhelet, on the corners. And unfortunately, for much of recent Jewish history, that has been unavailable. So that mitzvah cannot be performed. Like many mitzvot, we lost our chance to do it. But the Tekhelet is out there waiting to be rediscovered. And beginning already in the late 19th century, there was a renaissance almost begun by the Radzyner Rebbe, who was looking for the right animal from which to produce the biblical Tekhelet, the sky blue dye that is used for the wool, used to dye the wool. As a matter of fact, it's sort of inaccurate. Tekhelet is not a color. Tekhelet is a substance. It refers to the wool dyed this particular color, just like argaman and Tekhelet Sheni refer to types of colored wool. And all of those figured prominently in this week's Parsha because the first time we encounter Tekhelet, it's always next to argaman, Tekhelet and argaman, and it's a critical component of the vestments of both the high priest and the ordinary priests in the tabernacle and later in the temple. And we need Tekhelet in order for all of us to fulfill the commandment of tzitzit, at least in the fullest capacity, as I said. Technically speaking, if you don't have it, you don't have it. And also, God willing, soon, hopefully tomorrow, when we begin the temple service, once again, the priests will need some Tekhelet, and we'll need to produce the garments with this. So it turns out that Rav Herzog was onto something. He also became interested. Rav Herzog was the first chief rabbi, Ashkenazic chief rabbi of Israel, also a Rav in the United Kingdom. I think he was the chief rabbi of Ireland. He extensively researched the matter, and he got on the right trail of a certain sea crustacean. No, not a crustacean. It's a mollusk, if I'm not mistaken. You'll correct me also. You raise your hand and say, sorry, Grossman, you're wrong there. And that led Dr. Sterman and his colleagues to eventually discover what we now know as Tekhelet. So, Dr. Sterman, thank you for joining us. We are very appreciative.
I'm really glad to be here for Parshas Teruma.
Yeah.
First time Tekhelet is mentioned in the Torah.
Yes, and also Dr. Sterman's organization, Psil Tekhelet, go to their website and register for their raffle. It's actually free to register. They're giving out all sorts of wonderful prizes like talitot, or just some Tekhelet and some other things, and also help get Tekhelet into the hands or onto the garments of deserving soldiers and yeshiva students. It's very good. Go right there and check out his book also. Dr. Sterman, let's start from the beginning. When you were first started this, obviously no one had Tekhelet except for the Radzyner Hasidim, who were still clinging to their old Rebbe's formula that Rav Herzog basically, unfortunately, debunked. And it wasn't so common. Take us back. When did this start? What year? How did they get on the trail of Tekhelet, and in what capacity were you involved?
Okay, so there are a couple of different beginnings. My personal beginning is in 1991 when I became aware of this, and I became aware of it quite, I would say by accident. I had a friend, Joel Guberman, and he called up one night. He said, I met a guy, a rabbi, who believes that he found the real Tekhelet and he needs scuba divers to come find the snails. So would you like to come? So yeah, that would be great. Myself, Joel, and Ari Greenspan, we were 1991. So we're over 30 years ago. So that's a long time. And we were quite young and adventurous at that time. And so why not? So that was my beginning. The beginning previous to that was the rabbi who found this Tekhelet, who was the one who was looking for scuba divers, and his name was Rabbi Eliyahu Tevger. Rabbi Tevger was really the first person in modern times, and by modern times I'm talking about 2,000 years, or at least 1,300 years, to wear what we believe is real authentic Tekhelet. And Rabbi Tevger went down to the beach and collected these snails, and he found the way to do the dyeing, and it's a very, very exciting and serendipitous story. But anyway, he made 2 sets of Tekhelet, one for himself, which he put on his talis and he wore, and the other for his chavrusa, who refused to get involved in any controversy and put it in his drawer. And that was more or less what Rabbi Tevger wanted to do. He wrote a book afterwards, Rabbi Tevger, explaining all of the laws of Tekhelet, but basically that was where it was until we came in and kind of became a lot more enthusiastic about spreading it practically. But that's also not the beginning, because there's another beginning that happened about 2 or 3 years before Rabbi Tevger did this, which was the solution.
Oh, hold on. We lost Dr. Sterman, so we're going to have to... We lost you for a second there.
Am I back?
Yeah, now you're back. Oh,
Okay.
But maybe I can ask you a question about that. Rabbi Tevger, you said, was able to produce Tekhelet. He went and gathered enough snails in which to produce 2 sets, you said.
Yeah.
And by set, I guess you mean 8 or 4 strings. Because,
let's call it the Ravid string, so it's 4 strings, one on each.
Okay.
One
So
full string on each.
4 full strings of Tekhelet. And if he had already discovered a whole method, why didn't he start mass producing it then?
There are people who have different things that they do in their lives. Rabbi Tevger's felt that his mission was to understand how to make Tekhelet, to do the research and the halachic research involved in it. And at that point, we joined him. And, everybody has their own little tafkid in this story. And that was ours. But as I said before, there was a little bit of a beginning even before that, which is the discovery, the scientific discovery, which allowed Rabbi Tevger to conclusively prove that our snails, let me just show this to you if I can, our little snail here. I'm backwards on a mirror image here. So this is the snail that we're talking about. Now, this snail is not uncommon, but the problems that were associated with identifying the snail, the Murex trunculus is the Latin name for it, the problems that were associated with identifying conclusively that this was what the Talmud calls the chilazon, the source of the real Tekhelet, were insurmountable, I would say, up until 1985. And so then we go back to even further beginnings. We can talk a little bit about that discovery. But the beginning of modern Tekhelet research can probably be associated, as you mentioned, with Rabbi Herzog, who wrote in 1914 this incredible...
Sorry, we lost him again. Maybe I could fill that in. Rabbi Herzog, like I said, first chief rabbi of Israel. But before he was chief rabbi, he wrote his... we lost you for a few seconds. I was mentioning Rabbi Herzog wrote his doctoral dissertation or his thesis.
1914, yeah. Hebrew porphyrology. He invented that word, porphyrology, meaning the study of purple. And Rabbi Herzog wrote an incredible piece of research where he collected not only everything that had to do with Tekhelet from the Jewish side of things, all of the Talmud, Mishnah, Medrash, anything that had to do with that, but he also collected all of the research from the secular standpoint, the archeological evidence, or where it had been leading and where it had been pointing. The scientific in terms of marine biology and the chemistry. He was in constant contact with chemists and with biologists and zoologists and malacologists and whoever else you could imagine to find out about that. But Rabbi Herzog had an insurmountable problem. I don't know if you can tell what color this is, Rabbi Grossman.
Yeah, well, it's not like that blue and black dress. I could see it's purple.
You can see it's purple.
Yeah.
Okay. If you take our snail and you do the dyeing with it, I'm getting confused here with the mirror image. But if you take our snail and you do the dyeing with it, it's already been known for actually over 200 years that you're going to get a beautiful, gorgeous, lasting dye but this is the color, purple. And Rabbi Herzog could not accept the fact that our tradition, which says Tekhelet is sky blue, Tekhelet domeh liyam v'yam domeh l'rakia, Tekhelet is like the sky. In last week's Parsha, underneath the floor of the heavens is the Even HaSapir, right? Which looks like Etzim HaShamayim LaTohar. It looks exactly like the clear sky, and Even HaSapir looks like Tekhelet. So our tradition believed that Tekhelet was sky blue. And Rabbi Herzog could not get around this problem. He really wanted to believe that the Murex was the true source of the Tekhelet. It gave him purple, and that's where he was, and that's where he left it. At 1914, he was not able to solve that problem. In 1959, he passed away, still unable to solve that problem. And it wasn't until 1985 where he was able, the world was able to solve this problem. And based on that, Rabbi Tevger was able to conclusively say, okay, we've got our little snail. Now we just have to make the dye. He knew how to make it blue, beautiful sky blue. And this is Tekhelet. And this you can see is just a beautiful, beautiful sky blue. And this also comes from our snail, but there's a secret to it. I don't know if your viewers are ready to hear the secret. You'll let me know.
It's okay. Sooner rather than later, because, with everything, I'm time constrained by the missus and the kids.
Well, the answer really is, it's actually, Baruch Kashemesh, as they say here in Israel. It's obvious as the sun in the sky. And in 1985, the researcher who was doing work on these snails and the dyeing noticed that when he would do his dyeing, and it's a very, very smelly process. So he had the windows open and he would put the dye on the windowsill to keep at least as much of the smell out of the laboratory as he could. On cloudy days, he indeed got this kind of a purple dye, but on sunny days, he got a beautiful, beautiful blue dye. And that led him to research and realize Professor Otto Elsner we're talking about. And he realized that at a specific stage in the dyeing process, if you expose the dye solution to sunlight, then you will get beautiful blue, sky blue instead of purple. That discovery was written up in a paper in 1985. Rabbi Tevger saw the paper, Rabbi Tevger was made aware of the paper, and the rest, as they say, is history. So we became involved in this, and we've been doing all of what we can to produce Tekhelet for Am Yisrael from the first days when we were maybe able to make 5-10 a year to the current time when we can produce many tens of thousands for Am Yisrael. And it's really a wonderful thing to see it proliferating.
So here's the question that I guess everybody's asking. How is he so certain that it is? I mean, the Radzyner Rebbe thought he found it 100 years before that. I know that, let's say, the Karaites, although we don't take their opinion into consideration, have been saying for a long time any blue will do. There are even some who say that within the Rambam's opinion, at least regarding the priestly vestments, which I think were at least more important than, let's say, the regular tzitzit. The Mishnah says, I don't need the Tekhelet in order to do the actual mitzvah of tzitzit. White is good enough. But for the priestly vestments, it seems to be a critical component. Yet then you have a Rambam saying perhaps he says this, I don't think he says this, people say he says this, that any blue will do. So how do you know it has to be this? And how did he know that this really was it? Just because he was able to get blue out of a sea snail, isn't there other ways to get blue out of other creatures also?
Okay, so there are a lot of questions there. Yeah. I'll start with the last one. There aren't a lot of ways to get blue. When we named our book The Rarest Blue, that's because blue is extremely, extremely rare, not just on our planet, but in the universe. It's very, very difficult from a physics standpoint to make blue. In fact, the only dye naturally occurring that is produced by any life form that we know of that is blue, there's only one molecule, and that is indigo. And indigo is the main component of our Tekhelet, and indigo is the main component of the fraudulent Tekhelet, which was known even in times of the Talmud, known as Kala Ilan. So And now let's get back to the first questions. How do we know, or how do we believe, why do we believe that this is true? So you have a convergence of many, many different things. And the Radzyner Rebbe, and we can speak a lot about the Radzyner Rebbe, we consider ourselves working in the same tradition that the Radzyner Rebbe was. However, we're coming about this from a different position. We're coming about this using a lot more logic and science, if you will, and not trying to guess what might be the source of the Tekhelet only from the Talmudic sources. The Talmudic sources are extremely vague. Chilazon gufo domeh liyam. Its body is like the sea. What does that mean? What's its body? Does it mean its shell? Does it mean the body of the actual mollusk? What does like mean? Okay, so is green like blue? Is yellow like blue? So like is a problem. Sea. What color exactly is the sea? Are we talking about the sea? It's blue, it's green. The sea bed, that looks completely different. The water itself is clear. So everything about the one thing that the Talmud tells us about how we can find the chilazon is ambiguous. And maybe that's, maybe there's a point to what the Talmud is saying, and maybe it's not trying to give us an actual physical determination that we can go out then and find the sea creature, but it's trying to tell us other things, and there are many suggestions for what it's trying to tell us. But we have come about it from a completely different point. And there's a convergence of a number of things. Number one, we know that the chilazon, this animal source, we know that it lived in the Mediterranean. The Talmud tells us, Mi Sulamot Tzor V'Yad Haifa, along the northern coast of Israel. The Torah itself tells us that Tekhelet was found in Yechezkel. It tells us that Tekhelet was found in Elisha, which was Cyprus. It tells us that Tekhelet was being manufactured, and the expertise for Tekhelet was in Tzor, which is the Phoenician coast just north of Israel. Okay, so we know already that this exists in the Mediterranean. Well, so you can ask the question, what creatures exist in the Mediterranean that can give you a blue dye? And the answer is just our Murex snails. There is nothing else, at least that we know about, or that anybody in the world or any scientist knows about. So that's one method of looking at it. The other is archeological proof. And what we knew in 1991 was the tip of the iceberg for what we know now in 2021. There's been a number of discoveries. The early discoveries that Rabbi Herzog knew about were mounds of crushed Murex snails. So he knew that this was used in the ancient time in a number of places for dyes, for making and manufacturing dyes. Now we know that there are at least 60 different places around the Mediterranean where you can find the remains of archeological remains of dye houses that use these snails. So we know pretty much categorically that these snails were used. That's another piece of the puzzle. We know that this was something that was used in the ancient world and in the places where the Torah and the Talmud tell us that you could find the chilazon. Number three, archaeological evidence that we have unearthed over the last 10 years or more. Fabrics that were dyed with Murex snails, some of them purple, and we can talk about that in a little bit, and some of them blue, actually dyed blue fabrics, 2,000 years old, found here in Eretz Yisrael, in Israel, in caves that Bar Kokhba's men were in, on the top of Masada, which where the Jewish zealots were, where Herod would have worn beautiful, beautiful royal clothes. And they are categorically, without any doubt, dyed with our little Murex snails. And even linguistically, we know a little bit more about the ancient Semitic languages and even the modern Semitic languages. Chilazon, chilzuna. These are the terms that our snails are called by to this day in Persian or in Arabic or in Aramaic. And so if you wanted to know what the chilazon was, you can also look towards those evidence. And last but not least, we're pretty sure from the way that the Torah and the Talmud speak about this, that these were not just clothes that beautiful fabrics that were precious to the Jews, but rather they were something that the entire ancient world considered beautiful and luxurious and fit for a king. Mordechai yatsa milifnei hamelech. We're almost there. Mordechai in ancient Persia walks out in beautiful royal garb, and we're talking about Tekhelet there. So from Africa to Persia to the Roman Empire, these were the most luxurious and beautiful garb of textile fabrics. And we're quite sure now that these snails were the ones that were used by the Romans and by the Persians. So all of that brings us to a consilience where it's very, very, very difficult to argue with the fact that the Murex trunculus or the Murex snails were the ancient source of Tekhelet. That doesn't mean, and here I'm going to shoot myself in the foot.
Okay, please.
It doesn't mean that from a halachic standpoint, you have to wear Tekhelet. That's a completely different question. But is this authentic Tekhelet that Rabbi Akiva would have been wearing, and Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi, or Rabbi Yehuda himself, who used to make Tekhelet for his wife? That's a beautiful story. He used to tie Tekhelet for his wife. So was this the Tekhelet that they wore? I think that you can be quite sure that it was. It came from this snail, and it was probably something along the lines of this color.
So the Tekhelet, and I guess, correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems that the royal purple, the argaman and Tekhelet, are basically two variants of one substance. Just depends on the sunlight if you make it or not. And we know that the Gentiles were also quite fond of at least the royal purple and the Tekhelet. How is it that Tekhelet was lost to history for so long? Something that was so popular among Jew and Gentile alike. Many things the Jews have preserved, their traditions, their biblical text. Jews are very fond of mitzvot and traditions, and something that we ourselves lost and the Gentiles also lost. How could it go lost if it was something that was so popular?
So no one can be sure of that, but we have our ideas. Rabbi Herzog was really someone who was the first to try to tackle this question.
Yeah.
When the Roman Empire fell in the 6th, 7th, 8th century, depending on how you look at it, it didn't happen all at once. But the world was plunged into what was called the Dark Ages. Not a Dark Ages, the Dark Ages. And you're talking about within 100 years or 200 years, people looked at... Am I back again? Rabbi Grossman? I'm not sure if you hear me or if you dropped off.
That's
or if
both of us. I guess that's...
Okay, are we back? Are we both back?
That was both of us. Yeah, now we're here. You were mentioning the Dark Ages began with the fall of at least the Eastern Roman Empire.
Correct.
You're referring to the Eastern Roman Empire. And,
the Eastern Roman Empire, but no, the entire Roman Empire, the entire Europe
the Western
was plunged into these Dark Ages. So within 100 years or so, people had no idea what the cities that had been inhabited, what they were, who lived in them. So you really had this incredible loss of information worldwide. But specifically to the Jewish people and Tekhelet, there are a couple of things that you have to remember. By this time, and we're talking about the year 400, the year 500, Tekhelet and all shellfish dyeing was completely under imperial control and regulation. Justinius in the 5th century writes in his laws, no one is allowed to keep the purple or blue dyed fabrics in their house, and anybody who does, this is a crime tantamount to treason, which is punishable by death. So the Jews, I would say, wearing Tekhelet already in the later times of the Talmudic period was something that was very, very rare. It was dangerous. It was very, very expensive. And it was difficult to get because where are you going to get Tekhelet? Because anybody who's dealing with it is afraid for their life. And we even have stories in the Talmud and the Gemara about people who were trying to smuggle Tekhelet out of Eretz Israel where it was dyed because the snails need the Mediterranean. You don't have it in Bavel, in that area. You can't get Tekhelet. You can't produce Tekhelet. And as the Jews were smuggling, the people were smuggling out the Tekhelet from Eretz Israel to Bavel, they were caught by a giant eagle That's clearly a metaphor to get around the censor for the Imperial Roman army. They must have, gotten caught by Roman tax collectors. Like if anybody's ever come into Israel and you try to go through the green line when you have stuff that you're supposed to go through the red line. Well, in those days, the Romans were not as forgiving as the people here in Ben Gurion Airport, and somehow or another, these smugglers, if you will, were able to escape b'nes nitzlu, says the Talmud. But with a miracle, they got out there with their lives. I hope they made it out there with their Tekhelet also to get that to Bavel. But in any event, it's very, very rare, it's expensive, and it's dangerous. So most of the Jews did not wear Tekhelet already by the 3rd, 4th, 5th century, 6th century for sure. And the Gemara recognizes that. The Gemara says, Gadol onsho shalavan me onsho shel Tekhelet. If you're not going to wear Tekhelet, I can understand that, says God. I'm not going to punish you too much. Maybe there'll be a little punishment. But if you can't wear white, how hard is it to wear white? So at least put on regular white tzitzis. So the Gemara already realizes and recognizes that not everybody is wearing Tekhelet. But if it's under imperial control and the empire is falling, crumbling from within and being attacked from without, especially by the Arabs, and that's where Rabbi Herzog puts the demarcation line and when Tekhelet was lost. Probably in the 7th century, in the year 630, 640, the Arab conquest of this area of the Levant and especially of Eretz Yisrael, the dye houses would have been prime targets for the Arab conquerors, not only because they were producing a lot of money, which was funding the Roman war effort, but also they were the symbol of Rome. You were born into the purple if you were going to be an emperor, literally, in a room that was completely covered with fabrics from our little snails, purple and blue. And there was a mad lust for purple, says Pliny the Elder. Really, the Romans were very, very much associated with this. And so when it was lost, as they say, when in Rome.
Yeah.
And if we're in the Roman Empire and Tekhelet is lost, we do as the Romans, and we lost Tekhelet as well.
Now you're producing Tekhelet. I wanted to ask about Rabbi Rabinovич's connection to this, but first, is there anybody else besides you or your organization who is producing Tekhelet? Are there rivals or anybody else out there who says that perhaps that they have a better recipe or a different opinion about what exactly the true Tekhelet is besides for the Radzyners? Is there anybody making something similar to what you're making?
Okay, again, 2 questions. Are there people that are doing something other than Radzin Tekhelet and other than Murex Tekhelet? The answer is not that I know of. Every once in a while you hear somebody who says, I think that there may be some other animal or some other creature that could be used. One point there were people who believed that maybe the Janthina, which was peripherally suggested by Rabbi Herzog at one point, but Rabbi Herzog was never able to die with the Janthina, and no one else has ever been able to. So it's really a kind of a non-starter. And again, we don't know of any other possibilities. The second question you asked, are there any rivals? The answer is categorically no. Why? Because anybody who is making Murex Tekhelet is not a rival of ours. And we invite the entire world to make Tekhelet from these snails. It's not impossible. We have quite a bit of expertise in our hands and our fingers in how to make it. But it is not something that is ours. We have no patents on it. It is something that belongs to Am Yisrael. So if anybody wants to open a Tekhelet factory, by all means. And I think that there are here and there some people that are making Tekhelet for themselves or for their own little groups. But I think by and large, you might be able to say that we have the most, the lion's share of Tekhelet that you'll see is the Murex Tekhelet that we produce ourselves at Patil Tekhelet. Okay,
and here's a question that someone sent in just now. Do you guys? Okay, someone says you could hear me. Good. Are you machmir that only Jewish men be involved in the production of Tekhelet? I guess he's asking. I remember at the matzah factory that I used to go to back in America, there were quite a few women working on hand shmer matzahs mitzvah, but by the last year they had a new Chumrot, only Jewish men. And I understand the Chumrot also, a lot of mitzvah items Chefza mitzvah has to be made by someone who is obligated in the mitzvah. So that would disqualify, unfortunately, people who are Gentile. Do you have such a hakpada?
You could have stopped that question right in the middle. Yeah. The person who your viewer, are you machmir? The answer is yes. Anything that would have come after that, are you machmir on anything else? The answer would be yes. And we are very, very machmir on everything. And the reason is not because we believe chas v'shalom that any of the lesser standards, if I call it by that, or any of the more the less stringent ways of making tekhelet are not acceptable. That's personal. And anybody, can go to their rabbis and make those decisions. But we feel that we have to set the highest possible standard for tekhelet, because if you're not going to get it from us, where are you going to get it from? So we want to be across the board the most machmir. And let me tell you, I can't even, begin to tell you. Ceramic scissors. We only use ceramic scissors. We don't use metal. We don't use metal. That's a real chumrah. Rabbi Avi Grossman gives a hechsher on our processing of tekhelet, and every single person in our organization had to go. Anybody who touches the dye, anybody who does the tying, anybody who does anything had to go sit with Rabbi Rubin himself. Reuven from Rehovot, if anybody knows, that's just about the top of the line in terms of hechsherim that you could get here in Israel. And we had to sit, each and every one, including myself, had to sit with him and talk to him. And he had to be convinced that we were Yirei Shamayim and Shomrei Torah mitzvot. And that is absolutely a chumrah that we follow. We even follow, I should say, Chumrot that the Radzyner Rebbe himself was willing to be makil on. For example, dipping the wool a second time, or another batch of wool a second time into the dye bath. We don't do that. We dip the wool once, we take it out, and we throw away the dye bath. And if we have wool which is a little bit speckled or it didn't come out well, we will create an entire new dye bath with entirely new dye, and then dip it in a second time to get it to the right color. The Radzyner Rebbe himself felt that was a chumrah that was not necessary. We have, for our reasons, we feel that Rabbi Tevger, really, who is our posek, Rabbi Tevger feels that we should be machmir on that as well. So in any possible way, lishma, anything that we can do, we try to be machmir on.
So you just brought up two new questions. Let's say you have your dye bath. I assume it's a certain volume of dye that you produce. I don't know how much that would be. And you say you put in a certain amount of wool into that to dye the wool, and then you remove that wool, and then you do not use that same bath for any more wool. Is that the maximum amount of wool that you could potentially put into that particular bath?
No. No. I mean, well, it is. There are a number of constraints that you have. You have to be able to work with the wool afterwards and so on. We try to do our best to maximize the absorption of the dye, but you're never going to get it completely. So if you were to take wool and dip it a second time, you would get beautifully colored wool. That is what we call Mareh Sheni, right? Mm-hmm. Again, the Radzyner has a different understanding of it. We can get into that or not. But there are some people who believe that Mareh Sheni is okay. And if we're talking about the Parsha already, Parsha's Teruma, yes, there are many who believe, and this can get back to your question about the Rambam, there are many who believe that Mareh Sheni might not be okay for Tzitzit, but it's perfectly fine for Bigdei Kehuna. And so if you go to Machon HaMikdash, and you look at the Meil, Kalil Tekhelet, the Meil was made completely and utterly out of Tekhelet. The Meil that they have in the Beit HaMikdash, and we have one as well, that is made, of course, with Murex, but from Mareh Sheni dipping. Because Rav Ariel in Machon HaMikdash feels, and again, the Rambam could be pointed to in this case, that it would be perfectly fine to dip a second time Mareh Sheni for the Bigdei Kehuna. So one way or another, when Mashiach comes and the Kohen Gadol takes a look at that beged, he will either say, I'm sorry, this is Mareh Sheni, I need a different Meil, but I would rather have that happen than for us to have wasted I don't know how many hundreds of thousands of snails, and the Kohen Gadol, to get a first dipping, and the Kohen Gadol said, "What do I need this for? If you would have done Mareh Sheni, it would have been perfectly fine for me." So, so we may have erred on that part, but so far we don't have anybody who is upset about it.
Obviously, to make a whole tunic, the Meil of the high priest, entirely out of Tekhelet, would take a lot more than enough for an individual Jew to put some Tekhelet on his talit. I would imagine perhaps hundreds of talis worths of Tekhelets go into one Meil for Kohen Gadol, if I'm not mistaken. Right?
The meal that we made is 2.6 kilo worth of wool. Now, in the times of the Talmud, at least according to some sources, Tekhelet was worth 20 times its weight in gold. So ask your any of your viewers if they can do some quick calculations. 2.6 kilo at the current rate of gold, how much would that be at 20 times the cost of gold?
Well, I have it right here. It's saying that gold is US dollars is, hold on. No, it's not telling me. I don't understand what this means even. Huh. But I don't
tell you by the ounce or tell you by the gram.
No, but I'm actually a little bit concerned. I don't think the dollar's value is sort of on the down also, right?
Yeah, but gold is.
Hold on, 1 kilo of gold is $57,000 and change. So yeah, that's a lot. So you're talking about a garment there that
20
costs
times that.
Well, you're
talking about a Meil, which would have cost in today's terms millions of dollars. Okay, now that really brings us back to the parshiot that we are in, Teruma and Tzitzit, where we're talking about Tekhelet. It's important to understand this. The Torah tells you, "V'yikhu Teruma zahav v'chesef u'nechoshet," gold and silver, and bronze, Tekhelet, argaman, tolat, shani. They're the same kind of pricing here that we're talking about. These are fabulously, or I can quote one researcher who says they are stupendously expensive in the ancient times.
Yes.
Okay, and you're talking today, it takes us maybe 30 snails, 40 snails to make one set of tzitzit. And we're using modern chemicals, and we have scuba divers that can go find this all over the Mediterranean. The amount of work that would have gone into making Tekhelet and argaman, and the costs that could have been associated with this are staggering. So that's what we're talking about. The Kohen Gadol was wearing this incredibly beautiful and outstanding, in the literal sense, outstanding fabrics, because he was meant to represent HaKadosh Baruch Hu, God, on this world. And when every single Jew puts on a little strand of Tekhelet, then it's as if today he was wearing a string of diamonds. And imagine what you would, what your impression of yourself and your importance is if you were wearing a string of diamonds all the time that the king had given to you, right? Or that you went out and you bought with incredible mesirat nefesh, with the willingness to sacrifice, to put this kind of a mitzvah on yourself. You would not be acting the same, way, as my kids say. You wouldn't be doing shtuyas, right? You wouldn't be just, wasting your time. Talk about self-respect and importance and recognition that we have a very, very important job to do on this on this planet. That's what Tekhelet would have given us. That's what Tekhelet gave to the Kohen Gadol, the Kohen Hedjo, the normal Kohen. The high priest wears, as we said, all Tekhelet. The regular priest wears a band of Tekhelet, and each and every Jew who is, in a sense, also a priest.
Yes.
Every single Jew is part of this kingdom of heaven, a holy kingdom, and a priest in a certain sense. And you would expect that he wear that priestly garb, and that's what the tzitzit, I think, really are for us.
So before I ask you the next question about that brings up something interesting about Steel Tekhelet organization. I also need to plug the Haggadah Pesach. We're going to be going forward with the English edition. If you haven't gotten your Hebrew edition, well, don't worry about it. You can still order them directly from me. The essential thesis of Haggadah Pesach is that the commandments that are specific to the first night of Passover can all be traced to the theme that in the Jewish home in which they consume the Passover sacrifice, it becomes like a sanctuary itself, and all the attendees, those who are also eating the Korban Pesach, become like the priests. That's why we see all sorts of unique commandments and halachot to the first night of Passover. It takes this theme that we are all part of the Mamlechet Kohanim, a kingdom of priests, and the night of Passover, which is the night of the birth of Am Yisrael, that's when we go beyond just wearing a single string of Tekhelet. We actually enjoy even more of the commandments that are specifically performed by the priests in the temple. Now, Dr. Sterman, you mentioned about the rarity and the cost of making Tekhelet. I understand in the olden days where most things had to be done by hand before the Industrial Revolution. But since then, we've come up with ways, for example, fishing. We could go out to the sea. We have large fishing boats. We have canneries. I would hope that perhaps the production of Tekhelet can be on a mass scale and thereby, I wouldn't say cheapened, but certainly the costs have been reduced. Do you use any technological means to mass produce Tekhelet, or is it still done mostly by hand like it was in the olden days?
Well, here you come into the problem. I shouldn't say the problem that that you run into the issue of halacha. The halacha says specifically that Tekhelet has to be done l'shem mitzvah, l'chavana, with the exact and express purpose of making tzitzit and making Tekhelet. We are again very, very careful to do that. You don't need that. You don't even need Jews to be collecting the snails, to be breaking open the snails, to be preparing the dye bath. You don't need any. You don't need any specific anything specific for that. But when it comes to the processing of the wool and the dipping of the dye of the wool into the dye, from those moments on, everything has to be done with the express purpose by hand and for the mitzvah of tzitzit. We are always trying to figure out ways that we can improve the process and that we can make it more efficient. That for sure. And we have a number of very interesting little machines that we've put together that, for example, the way we do shazira, of course, it has to be done. We ply the wool together, the 8 threads of wool together. We do that by hand, but not, we built a nice machine that can do 8, 10, 12 of them at the same time, but it's still all done by hand. So we do have efficiencies. We've run into problems along the way. So, for example, if you were dipping and dyeing indigo, the best way to do it in the world is to dip, take it out, dip, take it out, dip, take it out. We can't do that again. Remember, the halacha told us that those could be problems of Mareh Sheni. We also thought about doing a pump that would constantly be circulating the dye water, pumping it through the matrix wool. However, we weren't sure, and the rabbis that we consulted were not sure if this would be a problem with hand dyeing. So at that point, we thought, well, maybe we could have a pump that had a little bit of a, it would be an electric pump, but it would start off with something that we would actually do by hand. So we had this hand pump that turned into an electric pump. And of course, you can imagine the comedy that ensued when all of these, contraptions that we were making exploded on us, and we're all covered in blue and purple. So, but we're always trying to see if we can somehow or another find the right combination between the correct technology, the right efficiencies, good machinery, but at the same time keeping as best as we can, more than as best as we can. We have to keep to the exact letter of the halacha in the most stringent way, as I spoke about before.
Okay, so now we got a question from a viewers here. You mentioned R Rubin puts his hechsher. I see the 2 dots here on the website. R Rubin is it, and also I remember a pack of strings they had R Rubin's hechsher right in there. Here in Israel, hechshers is a complicated, almost a political issue, because you have the Rabbanut normally gives a hechsher kashrus of food and food-related services and items. And then there are the bedatzes and the other kashrut organizations, and you have their equivalents out there in Chutz La'aretz. But Tekhelet, as far as I could tell, isn't really governed by the usual kashrus organizations. They don't really touch the Rabbanut, and certainly the bedatz don't go near there. How is it R Rubin became the mashgiach for Tekheles? Like, where did he come in? And if R Rubin himself is not aware of Tekheles, I don't know if he is. I'm asking if he's not, why wouldn't, let's say, one of the more prominent proponents, rabbinical proponents, of which there are, thank God, many and growing, and I assume there are many more who are closeted and just don't say they're wearing Tekheles, but they are. For example, even Rav Mazuz or Rabbi Rabinovich in his time, Rav Shechter in New York, and Rav Belsky, who later became even more of an enthusiast, Rav Zalman Nechebe Goldberg. I think the list can go on. You probably know more of them than I do. Why don't they give the hechsher?
Okay, so I always like to joke that we're the only place in the world where we have snails that have a hechsher.
Yes.
And, but the truth is, what Rav Rubin gives us a hechsher on, I'll be completely open and honest. Rav Rubin is not giving us a hechsher on our Tekhelet that it is kosher Tekhelet. He is not. What he does say is that if you believe that this Murex is the source of the correct source for the Tekhelet, then he guarantees that the Tekhelet that we use comes from this snail, and that all of the people involved from beginning to end are Yirei Shamayim, are God-fearing and kosher Jews. Rav Rubin is a very unique person. His hechsher, and it's not by accident or coincidental that his hechsher is considered one of the best. Rav Rubin is very, very careful and needs to see and know everything about the processes. He has come with us more than once to the places in Europe where we go to collect the snails. He's met the fishermen. He has sat there and broken open the snails together with the fishermen, and he's seen the process literally from the time that the snails are caught on their boats all the way till the dye comes with us to Israel, and that's the only way that he would be willing to give that kind of a hechsher. Listen, when you speak about some of the other Gedolim who give a hechsher, who might be able to give a hechsher, that's the best hechsher that you could ever get from someone like Rav Shechter or Mazuz or Rav Rabinovich or Rav Lior, and as you say, the list goes on and on and on. Rav Zalman Nechemia, all those tremendous Talmidei Chachamim. The best hechsher that you could get is by looking at their talis. If they're wearing our Tekhelet, then they obviously believe that it's kosher. Sometimes you want to get a hechsher that will speak to the more extreme side, right? Everybody will accept Rav Rubin. Some of those other people, although they are tremendous, great Gedolim and Talmidei Chachamim, there might be some people, let's call it to the right of them, who might not accept their hechsher. So, even almost as a marketing position, you want to take the most far Haredi, if you will, hechsher that you can get, and we're very proud that we have Rav Rubin's hechsher.
So you're out in the front. I see Rav Riskin is a Tekheles wearer. Also, I don't have a picture of his talis, but I think
very early wearer of Tekhelet.
Yeah, so he was early on there. You said that sometimes you even have to go as far as Europe, even though originally you told me and our viewers that this mollusks could be found off the coast of Israel and Lebanon in the Mediterranean Sea, but now you're going as far as Europe to gather them. Why go all the way as far as Europe? Are there too few of them around here? And I guess that means that you haven't been able to catch quite a few and even try to breed them en masse here in Israel.
Okay, so here in Israel, they live in the Mediterranean. They live all over the Mediterranean. You can find them again. Almost, you'd be surprised how many cities around the Mediterranean started their lives as Phoenician outposts. Mm-hmm. Phoenician outposts mainly to catch the snails. So the dozens and dozens and dozens of cities around the Mediterranean were started not by accident to catch these snails. So they do exist all over the place, and of course they do exist here in Israel in Chof Dor, which is just a little bit south of Haifa. You can find a dye installation in Haifa in the excavations at Sarepta. You can also find ancient dye installations. You can find the Murex snails, and if you go swimming in the Mediterranean with you can also find them. But we're not talking about finding one snail or 5 snails or even 500 snails. We're talking about many, many, many tens or hundreds of thousands of snails that you need in order to fill the needs of Am Yisrael today. And for that, you need to have a fleet of fishermen. You need to know how to collect these snails. And for good or for bad, they don't collect them here in Israel. First of all, they're protected under the Nature Authority. They're not in any way endangered, but they are protected. So go fight City Hall if you want to get some kind of a license to catch them. But more important than that, nobody eats snails here in Israel. But in Europe, you'll find these snails in the marketplace, and they're collected there. The fishermen know how to find them, and so just from an economic standpoint, it's much, much easier to set up shop over there, find the snails, bring in the thousands of snails that we need, and break them open one by one to take out the gland and what we need. It's much, much more economic. With respect to breeding, we are working with colleagues around the globe who are trying to breed Murex snails for different purposes. One of them is a group in the University of Mexico. Another is a group, it's actually from the government. They are looking to breed Murex snails. Neither of those groups have succeeded in going through the entire life cycle of a snail in captivity. It's not as easy as you think. You know, you have an aquarium, you get a bunch of snails in there, and you think, oh my God, I wish I could get rid of them. But Murex snails are a little bit trickier. They're saltwater snails, and no one yet really has come up. Here and there, we know people who have snails, and they've given birth in their little aquariums. But to do this en masse and to really have the research necessary, no one has cracked that snail shell yet. So we're working on it. We're working with our colleagues. It's not economically viable. And as you said before, we're always keeping our eye on trying to bring the price down. So at this point, it's much easier to work with snails that we can just fish out of the ocean.
Okay, so now we're having time for one last question. I had a list here. Obviously, you knew that I would want to ask you about a number of things, including the Timna discovery. That was just a few months ago, or a few weeks ago. It was in the news. But I want to ask something that's more practical that was just sent in and saying that I realized, oh, yeah, I should have asked that right at the beginning. So originally, Rav Herzog was able to get royal purple. And then Dr. Elsner found you add the sunlight and it turns blue. And considering that you're dealing with two molecules that are very similar to each other and it's in the solution, and it's about the sunlight, I would imagine that there's actually a whole spectrum of colors in between what you showed me before, the very sky blue, beautiful blue, and this royal purple. There's not exactly one black line between the two, and there's probably a spectrum of colors you could get there. When do you say that a sample, let's say it wasn't sunny enough, although you mentioned to me beforehand that you try to go and produce this where you will have sunlight pretty much most of the year without fail. Let's say someone does not dye it so perfectly, and now it is a tad to the shade shad, a tad of the shade of purple. How do you know once it's no longer Tekhelet and purple? You do a chemical test on it, or you say that, oh, it's good enough? Have a child look at it, just like 2 hours before we went online. We had a Megillah here where a lamed had its head detached, so now it looks like a cuff. And the usual test is ask a child who can read. Is that a lamed or a cuff over there? So where do you draw the line?
Well, look, the truth is there's only one halachic statement that's a clearly halachic statement in all of the Talmud regarding Tekhelet. It's a Sifta in Menachot. Tekhelet min achilazon kasher. Tekhelet has to come from achilazon. Hevi shalom min achilazon pasul. It's the same statement in the positive and the negative. It's got to come from achilazon, and it can only come from achilazon. And if it doesn't come from achilazon, it's not acceptable. The color, the exact color, is never mentioned in the Talmud, and the Talmud knows how to deal with colors when it wants to. Which leads me to believe, and I think a lot of people believe this, that it was difficult to make Tekhelet. You got it it came from the snail, you were very, very happy with whatever you got. If it was a little bit lighter or a little bit darker or a little bit more purple, a little bit less purple, it would all be great. And it would all be kosher, and you would be very, very happy to wear it to shul.
Okay.
But nonetheless, we do have a kind of perception, and here I think it's quite subjective, and it's the way, again, when we have these kinds of questions, we ask Rabbi Tevger. We're trying to get sky blue. If it starts to look a little bit too purple to us, we'll put it aside. And it's really just something that we have our own, kind of, as I said, subjective definition of, but that's basically the way we do it.
So what do you do with all those rejects?
There aren't many rejects.
Okay, good.
That subsequent to Professor Elsner, we have found that there are a number of other ways to get the blue out of the snail and not just purple. The most effective way and the most efficient way is sunlight, and that's still what we use. But we've also noticed that if you dye with and you get a little bit of a shade of purple, right? If you take it right away, not after a half hour or so, but right away, if you put it in very, very hot water, then that purple will turn to blue. Mm-hmm. So since part of the process of actually making the strings is to boil the strings that sets the wool so that they don't unravel, we hardly ever at the end of the process get purple. In fact, even if we try to keep it a little bit purple, we don't, it's pretty hard to find. If you wanted to get purple, you would dye it with purple and keep it dark, and then you would let it dry for a couple of hours at least, and only then you would start to work with it. So these are some of the tricks of the trade that we've found over the years. What we've discovered, we're quite sure that the ancient dyers would have discovered. So we're not any smarter at all. In fact, we feel humbled when we find these fabrics. They're very rare to find. But you look at these fabrics and the technology that existed 2,000 years ago, in Timna's case, 3,000 years ago in the time of King David and King Solomon, they were already dyeing with purple here in Eretz Yisrael. This is really incredible, and we are part of this long, long tradition of dyers, and more importantly, long, long tradition of Tekhelet dyers and people who wear Tekhelet. And I can't tell you how proud and what a great zechus it is for me to be part of that ancient tradition of people who were making Tekhelet for Am Yisrael, so that everybody could wear on their garments this literally beautiful mitzvah. A lot of mitzvot are beautiful. This is really, by every definition, a beautiful, beautiful mitzvah that makes you feel special every time and every morning that you look at the tzitzit and you kiss them.
Well, I have to thank you then for that. It's been 20 years now since I've been regularly wearing tcheles. As a matter of fact, I don't wear any form of talis, either talit katan or gadol, without tcheles. I've now acquired, I think, 5 talitot gedolot, 5 full-size talisim, and also 4 garments of talit katan fully tchelest over the last 20 years, and I try to keep that. So I thank you for that, and also thank you for joining us this week's Parsha. Everybody, this is Dr. Baruch Sterman, and he's the CEO and co-founder of Teal Tekhelet. So go check out that website. Go if you are not wearing Tekheles yet. I hope that, God willing, soon you'll join us in fulfilling this commandment. And you can find there's a lot of information there about how to tie it. There's actually, we haven't even gone into that, how you actually go about doing this mitzvah once you have the strings, because that's even more complicated. It's probably even more Talmudic. The Talmud, it's kind of almost a closed book with all the clues where to find the tcheles. But how to tie it, there's actually whole pages in the Rishonim. A lot of controversy there, which is probably even greater controversy that we didn't touch on. So I'm so sorry. But once again,
Maybe
Dr. Sterman, okay, so we'll mark that on the calendar, but we have to schedule that. We haven't looked that far ahead yet. But yes, thank you very much. And for our viewers, don't forget, like, share, subscribe, send in your questions or comments like you did tonight, and we'll try to pose them to our guests or try to follow up them. And if you have other ideas of future interviews, please send me a personal message. Shabbat Shalom, everybody, and good night.
Thank you.